Good evening, all. It's quite late in the evening. You've kept me out of my bed in the UK to talk to you, but I'm very pleased to be with you this evening. Um, I think I'm going to talk about something not completely different because I'm going to witter on about mud, but thinking about that context into which our biological products are largely being added. Of course, some go onto leaves, but many of them going into soil. Um, um, want to just share with you some of the work that's been happening in the UK. Might be useful, might be relevant, might chime with things that are going on in the US and Canada and more widely around the world. So my name's Elizabeth Stockdale. I'm the head of farming systems and agronomy research at NAICC, which sounds like it should stand for something, but the letters have stopped standing for something a long time ago, so we just use it now as a name. We're an applied crop science research organisation with farmer members, but also taking work all the way from field to inform the fundamental science and from fundamental science through to field. And the work that I do fits very much in the middle of that. So by background, I'm a soil scientist. And so I want to talk to you a little bit around soil health and thinking about some of the conceptualization and measurement of soil health in practice on UK farms. And I think it's really important to recognise that what we're talking about here is a term that we can define. We can be clear about what we mean by it, but that doesn't mean we can get that perfectly down to a single measurement or a single way of looking at things. Because if we're talking about soil health in the same way as we might talk about human health, we're talking about our capability of functioning, our ability to do what we are enabled to do within constraints. And so that might be for food and fibre production, it might be in terms of climate regulation, and it might be in terms of a whole range of other things too. So, for example, water regulation and catchment, mitigation of flood risk, and so on. And for each of those functions, we'd be interested in understanding and maintaining the function of soil in a particular set of ways. And in the context of food and fibre production, the things we're looking at, water supply, nutrient supply, rooting, plant pathogen risk, are often combined together. And we might talk about soil fertility in the context of those things, especially if we've got a broad approach to soil fertility. Equally, the term soil quality was used in this space for a long time. But just to remind ourselves, I think, as we start, that if we're talking about soil health, we're talking about the capacity really of that soil to stay in the optimum conditions for a multifunctional balance of ecosystem services. And in a place like the UK, that's particularly important. We've got a relatively small land mass with a high population. And so the land is needing to do a range of things for us. We don't have the, I say luxury, but the opportunity to set aside land in the same way into national parks that are used, completely with a focus on conservation, on biodiversity, landscapes. Our national parks in the UK are still farmed landscapes, and we have that very tight balance. And that'll be true in many countries, and even where it's not true for a country as a whole, it'll be true for many regions. So that looking at soils as a deliverer of that multifunctional balance of ecosystem services is really important. And of course, it's really simple, really easy to do. There's only a few interactions we need to pay attention to. I can summarize that in, oh yeah, it's actually quite a complicated diagram, isn't it? Even where we're only looking here at something like nutrient use efficiency, we have to be thinking about a whole range of interactions within the soil itself, within the plant, and those links between the plant and the soil, and then those links with management. And that genuinely is a simple representation of all those potential interactions, but it reminds us of the complexity of things that are interacting. And that gives us that context into which we're looking for a result if we're using something like a biological or even a change management practice, say in the context of reducing tillage or changing fertilizer input for a more manure or organic based input. Those interactions play out in lots of different directions so that the same management applied to a crop in exactly the same way in one year might give a very different result in one year than another. And that might be to do with a climate mediated effect. We're used to those in agriculture, I think. But it might equally be to do with an interaction with a cover crop in the interim that's changed the biological interactions in the soil. It might be actually to do with how the plant is interacting with the soil in a physical sense. Perhaps there's been compaction, for example, and of course all of those things might interact with one another. I think the other thing to also bear in mind here is that there is no such thing as soil. There are only soils, plural. And actually, in many farmers' land holdings, paddocks, fields, whatever we talk about in our particular area, there's often not just one soil, but actually even at that scale, a number of different soils, very distinct soil types, whether in terms of depth or stoniness or slope, whether in terms of texture variation. And so we see that working out in a landscape so that we see this diversity, and it's diversity that really rules in the context of soils. And it's really important actually that we separate in our own minds, I think, when we're starting to think about soils and soil management and that interplay between soils and the management that we put into place. The things that constrain function due to the soil type, things we just can't change. So stoniness, texture, depth. Unless you've got some dynamite locally available, then depth is one of those things you're just going to have to live with. So those are those fixed properties that need to be known, hence they need to be measured, but that set the character of the soil. I am who I am. I'm quite short. I quite like cake. That makes me not a very good marathon runner. There are a number of other things that make me not a good marathon runner too. But actually, physiologically, I'm not very well designed to be a marathon runner. I'm not a bad netball player, but I'm not designed to be a marathon runner. So my type, my character is actually setting some of the limits of what it's possible for me to do. But then it is possible for me to change how fit or how healthy I am within those constraints. And we can think about the same thing here with soils. So that soils have a set of properties, their soil type, those ones they've inherited through formation. We were reminded of that in our talk from the University of Sao Paulo, the importance of thinking about soil formation as a driving force here in terms of setting the context against which we work. But then we all know that soils of the same type can behave really differently. And that's as a result of, usually long term, but as a result of human intervention and management, so that management modifies properties. And that those measures that tell us about whether that soil, given its starting value, given its type, is in good health, are the ones that we might be looking for, and certainly were the ones that were the focus of the work that I'm talking about here, trying to give farmers tools to understand and better manage their health so that they could take informed action to know whether their management practices were making a positive or negative difference. And the approach was around taking that rotational look at soil health as we went forward. The principles, I think, to manage soil are well known. And we've used this diagram. It's in a book called The Principles of Soil Management, or a booklet, Principles of Soil Management, which is available through our UK farmer levy organisation. And it was that levy organisation that where I'll accredit it, and I've done so here. The British Beet Organisation and AHDB that work together to fund some of the work I'm going to talk about. And so we did a lot of literature review, we did a lot of looking at biological measures alongside physical and chemical measures and thinking about how those measurements might work. But as a starting point, we went to the literature very hard to identify what were the interventions that would make the biggest difference to soils being in best health. And remember, I'm talking in a UK context here, so there is a smugness, I think, about those of us who have soils and farm in temperate regions, where those soils are still relatively young, still relatively mineral rich, only emerging from glaciation around 10,000 years ago. And that's very much in contrast with soils, for example, in Australia or in South Africa, where those soils are actually millions rather than thousands of years old. But in the context of the UK, a focus on actually physical, chemical and biological interventions. And assuming you can see the screen reasonably well, I have no clue whether you can read by writing or not, you've kind of glimpsed those sort of things that we're saying here, the importance of soil pH in terms of chemistry, the importance of good nutrient management. These aren't things that would have surprised my grandfather if I'd told him. And actually, the things that we're writing here for biological interventions wouldn't either. So these are good soil husbandry, as it might have been called in the past. We've tended to use more technical terminology about management, and we use that word, management. I've tried managing my husband, doesn't work very effectively. Husbandry is around a range of different skills that are much more attuned to the local, to the context, and then driving the practices we adopt with an attention to their impact. It's really important here that we're thinking the UK very focused on crop rotation, both as a means of pest and pathogen control, but also in terms of soils, and signal and monocrops over a long period of time are relatively unusual, though the UK has tended to move, like many other places in the world, to much shorter rotations. And the tension now is to try and see what's possible to diversify those rotations and add diversity. And I think that's one of those interesting things that came out of the literature review here. Not just things we might expect in terms of soils and soil management, that is reduced tillage approaches, removing soil only when necessary, not just about organic matter additions, but also the real value of diversity in space and time. And that set of projects through the AHDB, and the second mention of its website, so there's a vague chance you've written it down, has produced an awful lot of materials, obviously targeted at UK farmers, but a real depth of scientific assessment and information in reports, but also farmer-facing materials, including that Principles of Soil Management Guide, but podcasts and videos and all those other things that we now are getting good at producing, because they really enable us as consumers to take on board information when it's convenient for us to do so, and in ways that make sense for us. One of the really important things we did, and it started in a project that preceded that one I was just talking about, hence the other banner down the side of this slide, was to think about how we might really start to operationalise soil health, how we might actually make it a set of tools that farmers could use. And here the target was to create a set of information delivery resources about soil health that were useful. So this is not just saying general things like, oh, it'd be good if you increased your organic matter, but being really useful in terms of, well, what does good look like if we're talking about organic matter? And is there a point at which good becomes too bad, too much? So is there a point in some soils where accumulating organic matter is telling us something that actually is going wrong? For example, low pH and accumulating organic matter as a combination aren't something that we would look at as good soil health. So we did a lot of work there, bringing together, and you can see in the middle there, the debate and deliberation until consensus reached, using specific knowledge, process understanding, rules of thumb, practical implications, thinking about it, and really chewing over how this might work. To acknowledge the input from Australia, I also worked quite closely with colleagues in Western Australia, but also more widely, again with some levy-funded work there, GRDC, looking at soil quality there. Soilquality.org.au was a website that has produced a lot of resources and actually pioneered this approach to bringing information together, particularly focusing on developing clear traffic light systems for information. So if we're going to communicate about soil health, we're going to need to communicate about something to do with physical, chemical and biological properties. We're going to have to look at a subset of measures, because we can't look at lots of things all in one go because our head explodes. But equally, it was clear when we talked to farmers that what they were happy looking at was a scorecard, a simple set of measures, the kind of thing that your child might come home from school saying they're good at art but not so good at maths. So that if we know those things, we can either target the resources that we've got. So the soil's doing very well chemically, it's got the right amount of the nutrients we need, but actually physically it's in poor condition, and that allows us to target our management practices. This is the kind of thing that we were focused on. For physical properties and for chemical properties, we were able to largely build on frameworks that already existed. But for most biological properties, including organic matter itself, there were not clear critical values or information on levels. And that's partly because it's complicated. It's partly because, as I say, there are soils, not soil, so that what we need is a number of critical values, and we need to break those critical values down. And here in the UK, we have taken that soil texture triangle that many of you will be familiar with, and for use by farmers, it's been broken just into 3 regions: light, medium, and heavy. So the lightest soils, those of you seeing me on the screen, acting it out at the bottom end of the triangle, the heaviest soils at the top. So the boundary between medium and heavy is around 30% clay, and the boundary between light and medium around 18% clay. And so we can see that the amount of organic matter in heavy soils, in those soils with more clay, capable of stabilising more organic matter, the number that we're expecting to see, the typical value, the target values are higher than they would be for a sandy soil. And if we take a number, say 3%, actually that number would, if we make it 3.1, it will put us in green as a traffic light in a light soil in this particular region of the UK, climate also being an important driver. So 3.1 would put us in typical green, in the light soils in amber, in the medium soils nicely in the middle of that amber region, and pushing down towards the critical, very low, likely to affect function level in the heavy soils. And there's nothing special about this. This is just a quick way of helping to communicate the data. But there's an awful lot of arm wrestling, as you can imagine, amongst scientists to get them to agree to where those boundaries might sit. And of course, in the interpretation, we recognise, and partly because the categories light, medium, and heavy are in themselves quite broad, that actually something at 3.1 typical, you'd be saying, well, that's actually at the bottom end, and it could potentially be holding more, for example. The approach to making those measurements in the field was also challenging to us to think about together with farmers, scientists, how the best way to collect that data. Because the best way to collect it, is to do it in one go, to collect it simply, to collect it in a way that actually is easy to do, that creates engagement to want to collect it more and understand the data rather than think, oh, let's go and do that measurement again. So here, the combination of physical, chemical, and biological necessarily needs a link between observations in the field at the time and samples sent away for analysis. So in the UK, we have something called visual evaluation of soil structure. There are a number of these visual soil assessment approaches, VSA, for example, in New Zealand, or as people will often just call it, a spade test. That is, we've got a block of soil and we've scored it looking at the structure. And we've shown very clearly that that is as good as a lot of other much more complicated measurements. And actually, it's really also very engaging for farmers, and they do a really good job of scoring soil quality or soil structural quality in that way. We could add in measures, and we do if we're demonstrating field days and other things like aggregate stability. But when we're taking aggregate stability, for example, as a measure and bringing it into a scorecard, is the values we achieve are critically affected by things like soil moisture content at sampling. So actually that seasonal variation and just literally day-to-day variation in soil conditions can have a big impact on the measures of the values we measure. And that makes it less useful as a robust benchmark to share. And so these are the factors we were taking into account when we were thinking about which things should turn up in that scorecard. The target here is to recognise that what we're trying to do is track change through time. And so there is an importance of capturing space, but space less important than time here. This isn't a measurement we're making to track change or to measure to inform management at field scale. It's a measurement we're choosing a representative place and then geolocating that point, and so easy now to do that using a phone. And in old-fashioned terms, still easy to do it by lining up a tree and a fence post. Depends on your landscape, of course. But sampling them with putting the bucket down in the middle, sampling them within 5 meters of it, in-field scoring for that visual assessment, and sending the soils away for analysis. And the little scorecard down in the right-hand side is one that we collected as part of our evaluations It was done in a replicated way. We were looking at change through space and time because we had treatments here, but this was a way of us just seeing if the scorecard really started to show the differences we were looking at. So this is a long-term organic matter addition experiment with the control treatments down the left-hand side closest to the attribute scores. And then as we move out to the right, we've got different kinds of organic matter additions. In general, what we see is that well, it's quite amber and red on the left, and it gets more green as we add some of those organic matter additions. The one line there that's odd is because that soil type naturally has quite high phosphorus levels, and actually any addition of phosphorus to that soil in here farmyard manure for a long time has increased the phosphorus store in the soil, which actually is a risk if that soil leaves the field. So it's indicated as an environmental risk. So just give you a sense of how that worked in practice, and now to credit McCain, who we were involved in looking at soil sampling ahead of their potato crops for the last 2 years. 682 sites, so not a bad set of samples, but not a perfect set, and really difficult with a number of variables we're looking at to pull out relationships. So these soils growing potatoes are typically light, and they're typically very light. So they're typically of texture that would be, so it's UK texture triangle, not a US one, but sandy silt loam, which I think doesn't exist in the US soil textures, but that middle of the bottom soil texture. And we can see here the kind of distribution curves, and onto those distribution curves, I've added green, amber, and red, or something that's fairly close to it on the slides. So that we're looking at physical, so dominantly those soils are well structured, but there are some that stand out as being poor. Remembering that we're communicating with the farmers here by showing them their individual scorecards, as well as letting them see the overall scores here. So a physical measure, structure, just an example of a chemical measure, available phosphorus, again, that typical bell-shaped curve, some green, some amber, some reds. And if we look at soil organic matter, what we really do see is that these soils tend to be low in organic matter, apart from a few that are pretty high, where the crops are being grown on histosols or peat soils. And for McCain, we took that work a step further from the scorecards, specifically asking to have a look and see if we would create them a soil health score. I don't like doing that because it tends to hide information rather than make it more transparent in my mind. So I'd rather give farmers 9 measurements, a scorecard with 9 values on it, 3 reds, 3 ambers, 3 greens, normally that. But then they can see where they need to take action. If we mix that up to create one soil health score, the first question is, well, which thing's wrong? And we have to unpack that soil health score. But the way we would do that, and this is no different than the Cornell approach, is to take the data that we have, so that's a pH range, to put those indicators now not as green, amber, and red, but to say, actually, there's an ideal, that will be 100. So that's bang in the middle of the green box, and that scale goes from 0 to 100, and pH is shown there because it's not a nice linear scale. Now there's a lot of judgment in putting those scales onto measurements, so that's not, it is science but not science, that's very subjective science, and a small change potentially in how we allocate those scoring things to any of these measures would make a big difference. And in the same, then we take each of those measures we've got, 9 measures, and we then combine them. So we're going to make a weighted average. We can make all of the things equally weighted, so chemistry, physics, and biology equally weighted, say, or we could want to put more weight on biology, and that will change what the indicator number is. I'm not going to tell you the way that McCain's have done their balance, but it's important here to recognise that those 2 steps can create a degree of subjectivity. The soil health scorecard, those are some examples there, drawn the other way to the ones I showed you a minute ago, but those are the measures that are there. One measure for structure, 4 measures that inform chemistry in the UK, and 3 measures that inform biology. And those are things that we have looked at very carefully to check those indicators are measurable by farmers, cost effective, and so measures like DNA we have tested, but at something still around £200 a sample are interesting for researchers, but not cost effective for farmers. Earthworm numbers, soil organic matter, and some of you will be familiar with the CO2 burst methodology. It's offered by commercial labs in the UK. I'm sure it's offered by commercial labs in other places too. And that's the methodology not done in the field, but the methodology using dry soil. So we're looking at what soil scientists would call the birch effect, the re-wetted effect. The big question, of course, is does better soil health give better yield? And I think that's really difficult to prove. I've already told you how difficult it is to put these things into the context of soil, that question would affect the yield of potatoes in the UK, from the management to the seed rate, to the occurrence of pests and diseases, to our temperatures and so on. There are some hints, though, when we look at the data, and I'm not showing you this in any detail today, at the link between soil health parameters and yield forming factors. So if we express yield now not in terms of a tonnes per hectare measure, but as in relation to the potential yield at the site, so that's expressed in relation to radiation received at the site in that year, its potential net productivity. We can see the yields there, comparing two sets of sites and comparing sites that were achieving around half their potential and achieving around 70%. They're both unirrigated sites, just again, so the management's the same. The chemistry was similar. The visual evaluation of the soil structure was similar. They are two pairs of sites, so it's two in each category. So of the 682, we can only pull down small numbers to do these kind of analysis on, which makes the statistics incredibly wobbly. This is proper marketing for you. But we've made sure that the VES is similar in both, so one green and one amber. The difference on the sites between those which achieve 50% yield and those achieving 70% yield is sort of shown in the soil organic matter when we look at it on its own, and particularly shown when we start to express that soil organic matter as in terms of whether the soil's saturated, whether the clay, the ability of the soil to hold organic matter, i.e. the amount per unit clay, is about right. And that's that further step in terms of looking at data and thinking about the measurements that can help us understand what's happening and why things are changing. So what about links between soil properties and yield or potential yield? From all the work that I've done, unfortunately, as a soil scientist, I keep coming back. There is no simple or obvious relationship. It seems to make logical sense that if we make soils better, that yield should improve. But there's no overriding impact of any single soil property. And in most situations, a combination of properties are interacting. So whether that's as a limit to productivity or essential to support yield. I think there is some hints of increased resilience coming out of soil health work, that soils are more capable of maintaining yields, and particularly here looking not just at a very simple benchmarking of organic matter, but that did show the difference, but actually pushing that benchmarking a little bit further down to looking at how much organic matter per unit clay in the soil, really taking texture into account. It's also really clear that management interventions and good management, that is good crop husbandry as well as good soil husbandry, are much more important than the pre-existing soil conditions. And that's because good management takes account of the pre-existing soil conditions to make its decisions. So it doesn't mean that those measurements aren't important, but it means that managers are taking them into account. I think importantly for potatoes, and perhaps in other contexts too, there's no evidence that maintaining soils at high, what we would call indexes, so keeping the soil reserves higher than recommended, actually gives you any particular benefit. So that maintaining an index at the low end of the acceptable range, but then managing fresh phosphorus and targeted phosphorus appropriately, and potentially and I was very interested in the previous presentation, combining that with good use of biologicals could be important.
I think it's important here when people are starting to integrate different practices, and you saw those principles for soil management that I showed earlier. So the idea that we might integrate cover crops to add organic matter, we might reduce tillage intensity, and as a consequence, we're likely to see improvements in soil health. The key there is not a single integration or a single practice, but that long-term rotational integration. It's clear, though, that things like a poor structural score will need more management intervention to grow a good crop. And so that link between soil structure and management intensity is there, but not that necessarily it affects yields if good management is put in place. And again, suboptimal pH or poor nutrient supply can delay emergence, but that doesn't necessarily feed through to yield. And I think there are evidence from particularly short season crops of reduced nitrogen optima because of better rooting and better use of water and soil nutrients, including nitrogen, where organic matter's better, and less evidence in long-term pasture and long season. In the UK, we would call those winter crops, but long season crops. And actually, what we really need are some more tools that give us not just general advice, not just those general principles for soil health, which I can draw out, but a particular answer for a particular farmer who asks us a tricky question. And there, what we need is that combination of good, locally embedded knowledge and robust science and advice. And for me, the agronomist has a key role there in bringing together that best science together with the local understanding to drive good management advice. Thank you very much for listening.